What up, everybody? We are ready to go, and Harmonica Luke is in for 1,000 Lance loot. The other two you're both a little too early. Let's see who else is here. It stands to reason, 500, and who is going to be third? Okay, we'll see who's going to be in for third, but let's get right into the video today. So we're just picking up Modern Moralist. You're in for 250. That's everybody. Excellent. All right, so we're going to continue where we left off with Christian Gonzalez's interview of Mike Huemer, where Huemer is going to make a case for moral realism. We reviewed some of their preliminary remarks, and they've gotten into a critique of emotivism. Just to be clear, I don't endorse emotivism. I do think a lot of the objections to it are not very good, but I don't endorse emotivism, and I don't really see any particularly good reason to endorse it in the first place. So, yeah, while I am an anti-realist, I reject all of the traditional anti-realist positions, and so I'll offer commentary on critiques of them. But ultimately, I think you should reject those positions.
That's just one example among many. You can do a disjunction where you need propositions for the disjuncts, right? You can do it's not the case that. You can do probably P where you have to put a proposition for P. Anything in the language where you can plug in a proposition, you can put a moral statement. So moral statements act exactly like proposition expressing.
So one thing I would wonder about this is whether a broader and more global expressivism or emotivism could account for much of ordinary language. So, what Huemer is trying to point out is that, well, it could be in principle. He didn't exactly say this, but take just X is wrong, like just some action is wrong. Even if that statement could function as an imperative or as an expression of an emotion, once you start taking moral claims and start embedding them in other contexts, I wonder if X is wrong. If X is wrong, Y is wrong, X is wrong, so Y is wrong. So when you start putting them into syllogisms, you start wondering about them, you start deliberating about them. In all of those other cases, they appear to operate the way propositions do. Now, one, that's true. Two, I'm not sure that really shows that they're not functioning as prescriptions or as emotional expressions in the typical context in which they occur. I don't think the reasoning or deliberative context that Huemer's talking about are all that typical of the typical expression of a moral judgment. So prototypical moral judgment is what we're really after here, which is conveyed through the language, because it's not like we're just looking at statements that aren't in some asserted context. They're in some context where a person is making the claim. And it could be like, what if we went out and we did an empirical study and it turned out, and remember, in the previous video, he said this is an empirical question. What if 98% of the time when someone says murder is wrong, they are just expressing emotion or trying to order people to not murder? All this stuff about how, well, in embedded context, they appear to operate like propositions. Okay, well, then in unembedded context, they don't, they express non-propositional context, and embedded ones, they do. Would that show that emotivism or prescriptivism are wrong? It's not clear that it would. So showing that something doesn't appear to operate a certain way in one context doesn't entail that it doesn't operate that way in the other context. It could turn out that the way that moral language is used is context dependent in ways that vary from one context to another. So that's one point. Another is that you could conclude, oh, well, they're used like propositions outside your sort of standard first order assertion. So it stands to reason that they are used that way in those cases, in those first order cases too. So in other words, when they're embedded, they're used as propositions. Therefore, they're probably embedded when they're not used in embedded contexts. That would be one line of reasoning. But you could go the opposite direction and wonder if, okay, so if they're not propositional in unembedded contexts, maybe, because keep in mind, part of the point is, like, take some statement, like abortion is morally wrong. It's a declarative sentence. It looks like a proposition, but the emotivist is arguing it's not. And so if they're already willing to say that, it's also possible that they could look at these other contexts, the embedded context, and say, okay, and I also don't think they're propositions in those cases. Huemer is taking for granted that moral language is used propositionally in these embedded contexts. And I think that that's something that we could question. And there are views out there. There is global expressivism. It is possible to restructure one's conception of what's happening with language more generally. And more importantly, if this is an empirical question, it's not something that we're going to resolve by, doing Huemer's standard strategy, which is to think about it. Just thinking about the empirical questions is not adequate to solve them. That's one of the characteristic features that makes them empirical rather than a priori. And Huemer himself admitted, he acknowledged earlier in this discussion that these are empirical questions. Thinking about it's not going to cut it. You need to actually do the research. And I don't think that the research unambiguously or clearly indicates that ordinary moral discourse is in embedded or unembedded contexts used in a uniformly non-propositional way or typically non-propositional way. It might be that it is, but that hasn't been shown empirically. So, Huemer is expecting his audience, and I think he relies on his own metasemantic intuitions or judgments about what he makes of these cases without actually doing the empirical work to show how ordinary people, what they actually mean when they say these sorts of things. So empirical questions call for empirical data, not what you think about them.
Sentences in every way that you can come up with.
See, this as if is key. So a lot of the emotivists, after hearing about the Frege-Geach problem, also known as the embedding problem, they've reacted and they've come up with a more sophisticated theory. So Simon Blackburn, Alan Gibbard, for instance, they've come up with quasi-realism. What is quasi-realism and what's wrong with it?
I think it's sort of like trying to explain how you can talk exactly as if moral statements were expressing propositions, even though they're not.
I'm not sure that that's right. So I took quasi-realism because quasi-realist views typically, they often include this like projectivist component, which it purports to offer an account of why the language can involve these assertions that could be true. They are true, and they are describing something, but it isn't the kinds of features of the world that are independent of people's minds of the kind that a non-naturalist moral realist would endorse. I don't know how they distinguish themselves from naturalists because the facts in question are natural properties, but they might not be the sorts of natural properties that naturalists typically endorse. So I don't know exactly what they say about that. But it's not the case, as far as I understand it, that they take it to be that they look like true assertions, but they're not, because they typically endorse a deflationary view of truth where they do take the moral statements to be true, or to be true enough in a certain fashion, but without taking on the deeper metaphysical commitments that a moral realist is going to take on. So I see it more as a project of trying to maintain distance from the metaphysical aspects of moral realism rather than the semantic ones. But maybe I don't understand. I mean, Huemer could just be right about this. I don't know. That's how I've taken it to be, especially because if you take a deflationary view of truth and you don't really have a problem saying, no, these moral statements are true. It's just that what it is that's true and what it means for it to be true differs from how your standard realist is going to take it. They're going to reject correspondence theory of truth, and they're going to reject some of the metaphysical things that a realist is going to endorse. I don't know why Huemer is saying this. I don't, that doesn't sound quite right to me. Why don't we look it up? See what the SEP says about quasi-realism. Yeah, so projectivism. Yeah, it might take too long to look this up adequately here. But it's something that I could double check and revisit, because I get a little puzzled when people characterize things in ways that don't ring quite right to me, but there might be something that I'm missing. Okay. But let's keep going. One moment. Okay, there we go.
Right.
How do they do that?
But I mean, I think you basically have to come up with ad hoc accounts for each particular context. Right. So, why do you get to say it's true that murder is wrong? Your theory is that murder is wrong isn't a proposition, so it's neither true nor false. So why does it make sense to say it's true that? All right. And then they say, oh, well, in this context, it's true that P just means P. And then you say, okay, and then why do you get to say, I believe that abortion is wrong? Because on your view, it's not a belief. Right? On your view, abortion is wrong doesn't express a possible belief. So how can I say I believe that abortion is wrong? And then they go, oh, well, in this context, I believe that P just means P, or like, right? Or you're just avowing the emotional attitude that's associated with being against murder or something like that. Okay, but basically, like every particular context, you have to give some account of what the phrase means when you put a moral statement in there, which is not what people normally think it means with a descriptive statement.
They'll tell some story about your attitudes can be quote unquote wrong in the sense that if you were in more ideal epistemic circumstances, if you knew more, you thought clearly, you had all the relevant information, et cetera, then you would change your dispositions or your attitudes. And it's from that hypothetical ideal situation that we can say things are kind of, true or false or right or wrong in reference to. I mean, at least for me, it seems like the quasi-realist is trying to have their cake and eat it too by saying, no, it's just emotion at bottom, but there's also like a truth component with like this idealization component, but it's still not ultimately really, really true. So it feels like they're kind of in an unstable position between.
Yeah. So I checked on this really quick, and it might be that some earlier versions were like this and the newer versions are not. I'd have to dig into it more to see. It looks like it might be the kind of thing, because quasi-realism is often conceived of as a broader project. It has evolved over time too. But it's not entirely clear. But roughly what you get is the projectivist component is an interesting one, because in a certain sense, you sort of paint the world with, or project your attitudes or sentiments onto the world in a sense in which your subsequent judgments about them, when you say, oh, it's true that this is wrong, are capturing real features of reality of a kind. Now, that might not be the kind that can support the metaphysical side of realism that Huemer is after. It may allow one to maintain a certain kind of it may allow one to make sense of the way that ordinary people speak and think without fully committing to the realist project. It's a sort of trying to thread the needle and offer a satisfactory account of why the language looks assertoric in a way that doesn't simply have a lot of the crude shortcomings of earlier forms like emotivism and prescriptivism, but that also doesn't fully commit to the metaphysics of like Huemer's position, for instance. Now, as far as how exactly they finesse that, I think it varies from one position to another. And it could just be that the early positions would be straightforwardly characterized as non-cognitivist. I'm not sure that's a problem, though. So, kind of a funny thing is how the non-cognitivist positions, as they evolved into expressivism, as they've added more and more components, sort of gizmos and gadgets, they've reached a point where some of the people that might be associated with a quasi-realism or contemporary expressivism, it's very hard to distinguish them from realists. And I believe some of them have sort of crossed that threshold and just said, fine, you could just call me a realist at this point. So it sounds a bit like they're describing the earliest forms of quasi-realism. And I think there's been some evolution there. The thing is, though, the one, like when they say they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, I kind of just agree with them about this. So I think that the positions, you could say that the earlier positions don't go far enough in adequately addressing what many people in these disputes take to be the realist seeming features of the discourse. They're not good enough to capture that. They're still too anti-realist to really vindicate those sentiments that people frequently share. On the other hand, the ones that go too far, now it's no longer clear. Go too far from with respect to moving from away from anti-realism. It's no longer clear that they're really anti-realist enough. And so there's a kind of trade-off there where the ones that don't, okay, so they're trying to do two things at once. They're trying to remain in an anti-realist position and capture features of ordinary discourse, which are supposed to be taken by everybody in this dispute, by the quasi-realists and the realists, to be realist-seeming features. And so they'll either be able to capture the language part, but they're going to have to give up the distance that they have from realism in such a way where it's no longer clear how much of an anti-realist position it really is, or they're just not going to be able to capture those features of the discourse in a satisfactory way, and they're going to remain anti-realist of a form that's going to be vulnerable to at least some of the objections that Huemer and others would have. The problem is that they're already sharing certain assumptions, and one of those assumptions is that there's all these realist-seeming features of the discourse. Insofar as quasi-realists are trying to vindicate an anti-realist project within the scope of contemporary analytic meta-ethics in a way where they're saying, okay, we grant these realist-seeming features, and we want to account for why it has, language has these realist-seeming features without committing ourselves to the kind of robust realism that Huemer endorses. The problem is that they're already granting too much to the realist. They're already granting that it has these realist-seeming features, and I just don't think that they should be doing that in the first place. I don't think it has realist-seeming features. I think that ordinary moral language is, and I get it certainly reported, it appears to me to be indeterminate with respect to most competing meta-ethical positions. Now, it certainly doesn't look like error theory, because error theory just shares the view that it looks like realism, and then it takes this metaphysical thesis that's independent of the way that the language appears. So it couldn't and doesn't look like error theory, but it's not at all clear to me that it looks like realism, and that if, to the extent that it isn't, we need to explain how, and that we need to propose things like projectivism. It's also unclear how you would test for claims like projectivism. Those look like empirical claims to me, and it doesn't look like non-cognitivists, quasi-realists in this case, historically have really done much work to empirically test these sorts of claims. I do recall Richard Joyce has an article about whether it's testable. I don't even remember what his conclusions. It was a long time ago when I read that. I wish I could recall every article I've read. So I'm not on board with the quasi-realist project. When they say it's trying to have its cake and eat it too, I agree. I think it does.
Wanting to say moral statements have truth values, but also they're really just emotional expressions of emotions at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, the anti-realists frequently want to make room for people to do moral reasoning. So they don't want the whole field of ethics to be made obsolete by the fact that there are no moral truths. So then they will say something like, well, but you can still do reasoning to try to make your moral attitudes consistent. And okay, so we supposedly still have reason to do that. And
well, that might be a mistake. When Huemer says we supposedly still have reason to do that, does he mean a stance independent or an external reason, or does he mean like it would be consistent with your goals and values or something like that? It's not clear, and he doesn't clarify. So, you can say that we have reasons to do things within an anti-realist framework that don't presuppose realism, and it's really important to be clear on what he means by having reasons to do these sorts of things.
And that's supposedly what we're doing in moral philosophy. Okay. But my claim is, no, there would be no reason to do that.
Yeah. See, what does he mean? There'd be no reason to do that. So here's a reason why you might, you could say, I have a reason to be consistent, because you want to be. That's the reason. Right. So, why yesterday I had like this, what was it? It was like a butterscotch pudding. It was a Nutella butterscotch pudding. Why did I have it? Because I wanted to. Do I have a justification? Do I have to have an intellectual justification? I ate it because I felt like it, because I wanted to. How is it, like, if that's not a good reason, well, what the fuck is a good reason for doing something other than, because you wanted to? And so you could just care about consistency. You could want to be consistent. You can also care on subjective or anti-realist grounds about consistency, not from a moral perspective, but you could say from an epistemic perspective. You could be an epistemic anti-realist. You could be a subjectivist. You could be a non-cognitivist, whatever. And you could care about consistency because you recognize that it's conducive to truth and you care about truth. So you could act epistemically. So in other words, if there's an epistemic system that's truth conducive, the epistemic realist would say you ought to employ this epistemic system independent of your goals and values. It's the most truth conducive. But that same system is available to the anti-realist. They could say, well, I think I ought to act with respect to consistency or whatever else is truth conducive, not because I ought to independent of my goals or values. What I mean when I say I ought to is that it's conducive to my goals and values to believe what's true. Like this just is motivationally and psychologically available to people to care about consistency. So if Huemer says you don't have a reason to, once you disambiguate what that would mean, it's either false or trivial and obviously untrue. So if Huemer means that you don't have a stance independent reason on an anti-realist view, of course it's trivially true if you hold the position there are no stance independent epistemic facts, and so there's no stance independent reason why I ought to care about consistency. It's trivially true that you don't have a stance independent reason. But if you have a stance dependent conception of epistemic value, where it's reducible to some fact about your goals or desires, and then someone says, okay, well, now you have no reason. Okay, well, to say you have no reason in that context would mean you don't have the desire. But if you do have the desire, that's false. So once you disambiguate what Huemer's saying, it's either trivially true or it's false. And it doesn't follow that as an anti-realist, you don't have a reason to care about consistency. Machiavelli, thank you very much for the $20. I really appreciate it. Quasi-realism would differ from contemporary moral realism in regards to the explanation of moral terms, mainly since there's a non-semantic function the quasi-realist is tackling, not a set of robust moral properties. Yeah, this is one thing though. Realists can still hold that, like pragmatically or whatever, moral language can serve an auxiliary or secondary role, which is to express one's attitudes or prescribe actions. At least one feature about these positions is that it's at least doing that. Whereas when you flip it, it often couldn't be the case that it's at least that. And if you had, it could have these other features. So realists can have the expressive component, but expressivists are basically, if you're not a non-cognitivist, you would say it's not propositional. But if it's propositional, it can include non-propositional content. I think that's consistent with what you're saying. I think mainly since there's a non-semantic function. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's consistent as well. I don't know exactly what the difference is, and it's probably going to vary from one system to another. But yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Eastkid, this is a good point. The culinary world is not made obsolete because tastes are subjective, and it's the same thing. If it turned out that the way that when people said things like "this pizza is good," it meant like pizza. Would that mean it's like pointless to care about what flavor of pizza you're eating, and that you have no reason to have consistent set of preferences or something? No, that wouldn't follow. Although you might not care if you have a consistent set of preferences or not. But I'll put this back up here. Thank you, Monkey Belly. Oh, the non-semantic function would be the role these expressions play in our discourse in the space of reasons. Oh, sure. Yeah. So it could be that like you're expressing a commitment to a course of action or something like that. And I think a lot of those features are quite central to what people are. They're more primary or more central. I mean, this is a point I frequently make. Remember, I did that poll where I said, let's say people were arguing outside an abortion clinic, and they could either convince you it's true that abortion is wrong, but it doesn't change the number of abortions people get. Like they're like, I think it's wrong, but they're all acratic or something, and they just get abortions anyway. Or they could just get people to stop doing abortions, but not change their beliefs about them. I think most anti-abortion activists would favor the latter. They would rather there be less abortions independent of people's beliefs than change people's beliefs without changing the behavior. And so what I think this shows, I know it is a thought experiment. So what it shows is, not very much directly. But what I think that this can illustrate is that when it comes to moral issues, people care more about the practical consequences than they do about the beliefs, that the beliefs are secondary, and that it's actually courses of action that is more central, more of a priority for most people in most ordinary contexts. And so insofar as contemporary expressivist accounts lean on people expressing commitments to courses of action or otherwise treating morality more as something that is involved in expressing things of practical concern to people, I think it's more on point in what it's capturing more generally about how language typically functions and what it's for. Language is for action. It's not for proposition asserting. Proposition asserting is subordinate to the coordinative and social and action-oriented roles that language typically plays. So language should be seen generally, not just in the context of morality, as action or practically oriented first and foremost. And proposition asserting is fully subordinate to that. Nobody just goes around asserting propositions for no reasons. Oh, right. Hard Work says, so is it possible to think there is moral realism for some possible set of moral facts and also from some morals are subjective? Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And so you have someone like David Wong who has like a hybrid position. So what he would say is that it's not that there's a single stance independent set of moral truths, and it's not the case that relativism is like totally unbounded and that any possible moral system can be equally as true as any other. Rather, there would be constraints. And so you could have two different moral systems that have different resolutions to coordinative or social ways of organizing, where they have substantively different moral standards. But since both are consistent with like serving human interest or the interest of rational agents in a way that promotes cooperation in a flourishing society, since both are alternative systems that both achieve that same outcome, they're both true relative to their respective frameworks. And so you can have relativism nested within realism. So could you think that you have realism and then some things are subjective? You actually have realism and think everything is subjective. So those are actually consistent with one another. What realism is inconsistent with is stance dependence. And in this particular case, I don't know how he would address whether or not what makes one system true or versus another system. Is it stance dependent? Because if so, then you're going to have something a little funny there. I don't know how you would thread that needle, but you could have in the more traditional sense, realism with indexicality. So at the very least, you could have realism without, so the moral facts are stance independent, but they are relative. So it also depends on what you mean by subjective. It depends if you're talking about indexicality or whether you're talking about stance dependence. If you're talking about stance dependence, I'm not quite sure you could have that in a straightforward way. I'll talk about one way in which you could have it though, which is straightforward. But the nested way that I was just talking about, I'm not sure you could have that so easily. But you could certainly have realism with indexicality, and that would just be multiple different moral systems, which are all true relative to their respective frameworks, but they're stance independent. The issue with the Wong account is I don't know if those moral facts are stance independent or not, or at least fully stance independent. Now, the easy way that I mentioned, I said I was just going to mention, is you could say, look, some moral truths like torturing people for fun, that's stance independently wrong. And then other moral truths like euthanasia, those are subjective or stance dependent or relative to different cultures or societies in a way that's made true by the respective standards of those cultures or the attitudes of the people within it. So yeah, you could just hold some moral truths are stance independent and some are stance dependent. In that case, you're still a realist. So realism only requires one stance independent moral fact. You're a realist. So realism is very purist. I should say anti-realism is very purist. If there's even one realist truth, then anti-realism is out the window. Whereas realism can tolerate some subjectivity or stance dependence. So one way to put it would be your system can be realist even if there's some maybe that's the way to make sense of the Wong account, which is that even if there's a degree of stance independence, there's still stance independent constraints on the stance dependence. So there's a sense in which is realist. Anyway, I think that's how I would capture it as being a realist account. So it's like those constraints are stance independently true. Boom, you've got realism. So as long as you've got one realist fact, you've got a type of realism. But realism would then be able to tolerate a very large amount of anti-realism, whereas anti-realism can't really tolerate any realism. RJB echoes a curiosity, says, I think Huemer might meant anti-realists would have no objective. Yeah, stance independent reason, which is usual smuggling moral realism and to disprove anti-realism. Right, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to say that the anti-realist doesn't have any, hey, if you're an anti-realist, you don't have any stance independent reason to favor consistency. Of course you don't. So how is that a problem? Oh, right. Machiavelli, thank you for the $5 now. Appreciate it. In regards to quasi-realism versus realism, you might read a paper in meta-ethics and the problem of creeping minimalism. I think I have read that paper. Let me see if I have it on my computer. I have a problem of, yeah, it's right here. See, I'll pop it up here. Oh, it's not easy to just share screen, but let me see if I can do that. Why is it not showing? Ah, there it is. Yeah, so I've got the paper here, and I've probably read it at some point, but my goldfish memory. I already forgot what was in it. By the way, it's not true that goldfish have a short memory, so I shouldn't perpetuate that myth. All right. Let's get back to the video in a second. There we are. Yeah, so maybe it's a paper I should go refresh on.
Like if there aren't any objective moral truths, there'd be no reason to worry about the consistency of your.
There we go. RJP, you were right. Look at what he said.
Attitudes, what we're doing in moral philosophy. Okay. But my claim is no, there would be no reason to do that. Like if there aren't any objective moral truths, there'd be no reason to worry about the consistency of your attitudes.
What? Mike, come on. Okay, so the idea here would be if there's no objective truth, there would be no objective reasons, right? No stance independent reasons to care about consistency. Of course, an anti-realist is going to acknowledge that. They reject that there's stance independent reasons for things. So they don't think it's real frustrating because the objection here might sound forceful, but it's not forceful at all. So a position which holds there's no stance independent reasons for things, of course it doesn't think that there's stance independent reasons to be consistent. It thinks their stance dependent reasons to be consistent. Now, maybe an expressivist wouldn't think that, but an expressivist would just say, look, there's no stance independent fact of the matter one way or another about these sorts of things. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not making any mistakes if I care about consistency, if I value it, if I think yay consistency and boo inconsistency and act accordingly. What's the problem? There is no problem. It's just not a problem. So this notion that you would have no reason makes it sound like the anti-realist could say, because keep in mind, he said no reason, then he made it clear he was talking about objective reason. So RGB, you were right. Of course they agree. They have no objective reason to care about consistency. Of course they agree with that. What's the problem though? What's the problem? I think I have no object. So take it back to the restaurants, right? You go to a restaurant. There's a dish that you like, and set aside all issues of nutrition and cost of the food and ethics. Like it's not like you're eating, raw human flesh or something like that. Take out all the nonsense, right? And you're just a purely gastronomic, like what tastes better, right? Or what gastronomic experience do you want to have? Okay, we'll put it that way. What gastronomic experience you want to have? There's a dish that you like. I don't know. It's pasta Alfredo or whatever. And then there's another dish you don't like. It's living grubs in a big pile, and you just eat them with your hands in gravy. That sounds so gross. Okay, the latter, I wouldn't eat that. I would choose the first one. I'd choose the Alfredo over the grub pile. The grub pile sounds disgusting. But I don't think there's any objective reason to prefer the food that I like over the food that I don't like. Does that mean, is that a problem? Am I making an error? Am I making some kind of mistake? No, that's silly. So anti-realists that take subjectivist or expressivist views don't have a problem for accounting for rational behavior in that context. Just transpose that over to morality. So they have a couple courses of action. They could take care of their children, or they could set their neighbors on fire. And let's say the person's not an evil psychopathic monster. They really want to take care of their children, and they like their neighbors and don't want to set them on fire. They have no objective reason. It's true. They have no objective reason to take care of their children instead of setting their neighbors on fire, or to be kind to a stranger instead of committing genocide all day long, right? They have no objective reason to do those things. So they could just do the things they prefer. What's the problem? It's very strange what is the objection supposed to be exactly? Very, very, very strange. And RGB, you were totally right. Good job. Salman asked, do you know of literature that dives deep into the kind of relation independence assumed in stance independence? No. Nope. There's a grounding literature, but I haven't seen much on the stance independence stuff. East Kid says, dogmatism as second order moral judgment seems goofy to me. I don't think realists genuinely follow to the extent they believe. Can you elaborate on that? What exactly do you have in mind? East Kid says, what objectively tastes better translate into an ought, thus becoming a moral question or no? No, something being an ought doesn't make it a moral issue. So the moral domain isn't defined by it being characterized in terms of things you ought or ought not do. Let's say a person's going scuba diving and someone says you ought to avoid barracuda. That's not a moral ought. That's like a prudential ought. You should keep away from them because they're aggressive and they might bite you. So it's a weird example, but I think you get the idea. Reader for Life, that would take us too far afield. But can Twin Earth really tell us anything meaningful? I really don't think so. I think that approach to language is misguided, and that the externalism internalism debate is confused and largely a waste of time. All right. And there was something someone said earlier that I want to get to as well. They asked me about Nietzsche, I think. Off topic, but what's your favorite Nietzsche work? So it's actually the first one I read, which is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I think it's just got a lot of banger lines in it. But he also has the short essay. Let me see if I can find it. And it's one of my favorite things from him. Where is it? I'm trying to find it. Yeah. It's called On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. Absolutely awesome. And it's like 2-3 pages. Oh, no, it's longer than that. They see in here, it says it's 8 pages. But it's very, very short. So let me put the name of that for this question here. On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. It's a really cool essay. And a good thing about it is that it still has his kind of poetic flair, but it's less esoteric and hard to understand than Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Don't get me wrong. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the first paper I ever wrote about, was on the concept of the Ubermensch or Overman. I like that Kaufman used Overman rather than Superman. And so I had to read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. A man comes down from the mountain and there's an eagle and I don't know what the guy on a tightrope. It all sounded insane to me. So I got the Kaufman translation with a commentary, and it took a lot of work to make sense of it. And it was a rare case of me thinking, this sounds like a bunch of nonsense, and then discovering, oh, it's not nonsense. It really is just absolutely laden with allusions and references, and it was like non-obvious what it meant and what it was trying to convey. And I thought it was just really, really cool. And that always stuck with me, that particular book, as just being just cool. Like but that essay, check that out, because it's very cool. And it's more accessible. I'm not saying it's the easiest thing to read in the world, but it's still pretty cool. So check that out to answer that question. East Kid says, what I mean in my comment, I feel realists unknowingly are driven by first order judgments and use second order claims for rhetorical purposes. Yeah, I think that might be true. It's hard to demonstrate that empirically, though.
The reason why we care about the consistency of our beliefs is that inconsistent beliefs are guaranteed to be false.
Right.
That's one reason. You could also care about inconsistent beliefs because you don't want to have them. It could be for aesthetic reasons. You could care about inconsistent beliefs because it could harm your reputation. But certainly, inconsistent beliefs, it's guaranteed one of them is false. This is entirely consistent with being an anti-realist. Anti-realism doesn't somehow entail that you don't care about what's true. It's just that whether the epistemic practices that you employ in pursuit of truth, if you're an epistemic anti-realist, you don't think that you ought to act on them independent of whether it's in your goals or interest to do so. If you're an anti-realist about this, you could think, I care about truth because it's in my goals or interest to care about truth. So anti-realists don't really have a problem accounting for this. This is not an issue.
Yeah, that's Parfit's argument.
But yeah, okay. And then if there's no facts, then it doesn't matter, right?
What? Anti-realism is not the view that there's no facts. What is he talking about? Anti-realism, these are forms of normative anti-realism. Normative anti-realism holds that there's no facts about what you should or shouldn't do, or what's evaluatively good or bad, or what you ought or ought not do. It only rejects that deontic language. It's not a rejection of there being facts. It's not a rejection of there being truths. You could totally think that there are truths out there and there's facts about your values. And with respect to achieving your values, there's going to be stance-independent facts about what course of action will better achieve your values or not. Let's say you don't want to fall to your death. Okay, and you're standing by the edge of a cliff, and if you took a step to your left, you'd fall off the cliff, and if you took a step to your right, you would step it further from the cliff and be safe. Okay, so it's stance-independently true that stepping to your left would lead to your death, and stepping to your right would not. Stance-independently true. But it's still a fact that whether you could cash this out in terms of whether you ought to step left or right depends on your values, right? So the normative language is reducible to facts about what your attitudes, if you're some kind of expressivist, or your goals or desires are if you're subjectivist. It has nothing to do with not thinking there are facts. Huemer is saying this as if an anti-realist is an anti-realist about like reality, or that there's no facts. It's just a denial of normative facts.
And by the way, this is also true, for things that are clearly non-cognitive, I desire that there be an end to world hunger. It's highly unlikely that there's going to be an end to world hunger. That doesn't make my desire at all defective to any degree. But if I believe that there's going to be an end to world hunger, that's a defective belief because it's highly unlikely, okay? So there's nothing at all wrong with having a desire for something that's highly unlikely or even impossible. That doesn't make anything wrong with the desire, okay? So that's why if the non-cognitivists were correct, there'd be no reason to do moral reasoning. There'd be nothing wrong with
why
having moral beliefs that don't fit together.
Right. And this is the main
there would be nothing objectively or stance independently wrong with it. So what? I am struggling to understand what his point is here.
That's a defective belief because it's highly unlikely, okay? So there's nothing at all wrong with having a desire for something that's highly unlikely or even impossible. That doesn't make anything wrong with the desire, okay? So that's why if the non-cognitivists were correct, there'd be no reason to do moral reasoning. There'd be nothing wrong with having moral beliefs that don't fit together.
Right. And this is
there wouldn't be anything stance independently wrong with it. That's trivially true. So what? What is his point?
the main gripe I have with the quasi-realist is why do we care about this hypothetical idealized circumstance where we're thinking more clearly and we have more information? Why do we care about that? Presumably it's because if we're in those situations, we're more likely to get things right. But there is no rightness. There is no truth of the matter.
What? What is he talking about? It kind of sounds like he's talking. I mean, first of all, he's framing it in terms of like some sort of ideal state. I'm not quite sure that's a typical feature of quasi-realism. Maybe it is. Maybe they just understand quasi-realism better than me. It kind of sounds like he's describing something like ideal observer theory, though. Maybe somebody in the chat, you have a sense, but I'm not quite sure that he's framing things in a reasonable way here. But it's still unclear what the objection is.
It's ultimately just expressions of emotion. So if you that, why do we care about this hypothetical idealized circumstance where we're thinking more clearly and we have more information? Why do we care about that?
You can, to the extent that you have a moral system, some anti-realist system, this sounds like he's describing Humean constructivism or ideal observer theory or something like that. Maybe quasi-realism has features like this as well that I don't know about. But you can just care about those things. So you could think, man, if I had more information, what would I do? So like take a career choice, right? So you're 18, you're trying to decide what career to pursue. And there's a hypothetical version of you that's super well informed. What would they choose? Or there's a hypothetical version of you that doesn't have all your biases. And if you could know what they would choose, you might judge, okay, that is what would serve my long-term interest. That's what I want to do. So I'll do what they would recommend. I'll do what they would do. You can favor doing that because you want to. It doesn't have to be true. And it could also turn out that insofar as these are descriptive accounts, a proponent of these accounts could just say, this is what people are doing. So some question like, but why should they, is missing the point. So to the extent that these accounts are intended to be descriptive, this sort of objection doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it's a descriptive account. Insofar as these accounts are prescriptive, one could simply have that as a value to say, I value doing what this more fully informed or ideal version of me would favor. You could just care about that on anti-realist grounds. So from both ends, this seems confused and like an objection that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Presumably, it's because if we're in those situations, we're more likely to get things right. But there is no rightness. There is no truth of the matter. It's
no. Okay, so I see why he's saying this. So he seems to be thinking if you're an anti-realist, it wouldn't make sense for you to care about what a more fully informed or ideally rational or whatever, I don't think he said exactly those terms, what they would favor. And the idea seems to be the only reason you care about what they think is because they're more likely to be right about the objective moral truths. No, that's not the only reason. You could think that you could think on descriptive grounds, this is what people do. And in which case, if you're offering a descriptive account, you don't need the normative element of it. And this sort of objection doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He could think that people care about these things because they care about the objective truths, but then that would just be to claim that the descriptive account is false, that people actually are realists. But people can just value the ideal version of themselves independent of whether the beliefs are true or not. But second, go back to the case of a person trying to choose a career. That person could be deliberating and thinking, what would an ideal version of me favor? Not because they want to know what the correct course of action would be, but because they want to choose the course of action that would best fulfill their interest, and they're not in possession of all the non-normative facts that are relevant to choosing what would be in their best interests. Go back to the restaurant example. Now, there's a version of me. Let's say I go to a new restaurant and I've never tried any of the dishes on the menu. It's food I've never had. Like I go to Kazakhstan and I eat the food there. I've never had Kazakh food, I don't think. And so I'm eating all the food on that menu, right? Sorry, I'm looking at all the food on that menu and I'm trying to decide which one dish to get, right? Okay, and I've never tried any of it. Now, there's a version of me, the actual me, that's never tried any of the food on the menu. Okay, and so I'm going to make my best informed judgment about what I would choose to eat. Now, there's also a hypothetical version of me that's tried all the dishes, and maybe not at once, like they went back and they tried them all one at a time or something, under perfect, like they weren't in a bad mood when they tried them. So they're under ideal conditions. They tried every dish on the menu. That version of me is in a better position to judge what I should choose. So when I go to the restaurant, it would make total sense for me to say that I would like to choose the dish that a fully informed version of me that's tried all the dishes would choose. Now, does that commit me to gastronomic realism? Does it mean that I'm wondering what the correct, like the objectively, independent of my preferences, correct food dish to choose is? No. What it means is that a better informed version of me is better able to act on my terminal values with respect to my goals than I am. And so I want to know what that person would act on, because it would be a better way of satisfying my goals. We're not perfectly capable, because we're not omniscient, to act on our goals in the most expeditious and effective way. And so some of these theories are predicated on the idea that I myself recognize my cognitive and affective constraints and limitations. And I am committed to thinking that I would act on what I would do were I better in control and better informed, and I was limited in these. I didn't have these cognitive biases influencing me, and I had more information. Both of those factors, once eliminated, would lead to choices that would be better from a subjective point of view. So, let's say a person is trying to decide how to handle a situation they're very upset about or they're very sad about. They could think, I would rather be the version of me that would act sober minded, not because they're committed to realism, but because they recognize that they have cognitive and like acratic and other sorts of psychological limitations. And a person might wonder what facts there are, these non-normative facts that are relevant to assessing what dish would be better or not. So, I might go to a restaurant and see two dishes, and one of them sounds better on paper, right? Like literally paper. I'm looking at the menu, and I'm like, ooh, the pasta sounds better than the salad. But it could turn out, unbeknownst to me, that this restaurant has the most banger salad in the universe, and they're not that good at their pasta. I don't know that necessarily. And if I knew that, my decision would change. So this idea that the only reason that you would care about being being better informed or more rational or whatever is so that you could better judge what these stance independent normative truths are makes no sense at all. There's no reason to think that that's the case. And he's just wrong about this.
Ultimately, just expressions of emotion. So it feels very unstable to me, very inconsistent.
Yeah. It's like, why would I care?
What's the instability or inconsistency? Yeah.
What the ideal?
But there is no rightness. There is no truth to the matter. It's ultimately just expressions of emotion. So it feels very unstable to me, very inconsistent.
Yeah. It's like, why would I care what the idealized version of me would feel? Because I'm not the idealized version of me. I'm the.
You just could care. So when he says why, you just could. I don't necessarily care. I don't endorse those theories. But what's the inconsistency? What's the error? And I just gave a bunch of reasons why someone might care. They're pretty good reasons, I think. So there's a certain sense in which I would care in certain contexts. Now, it could be that a genuinely perfectly rational and fully informed version of you would be so alien that you wouldn't care. And maybe you're not in a position to know that. But when it comes to like the restaurant example I gave, totally, I'd rather act on what the fully informed version of me would choose for obvious reasons, right? And so I've already given you examples of why a total anti-realist about a particular normative domain would care what a fully informed and rational version of them would favor. How have Christian or Mike in any way shown that this would be inconsistent, that this would be erroneous? I mean, think about it yourself for the people in my audience. So you go to this new restaurant, you've never had any of the food there, and you could have the dish based on one of two versions of yourself. Your current version that has no idea, like you don't actually know which dishes are good or bad. Or a version of you, a hypothetical version of you that tried all the dishes and can say, no, it might not look like it, but actually menu item number 17, that's the best one. It's amazing. And what that would cash out as, like what would that actually mean? What it would mean is that in a bunch of counterfactuals in which you try each one of the dishes, the one in which you have dish number 17 is the one where you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And all the others are less good. So which would you prefer? Would you prefer the version of you that's ignorant of which dish you're going to like the most? Or would you prefer to have the dish of the informed version of you? I would rather have the dish of the informed version of me. And you could simply transpose this over to moral issues. So there's a version of you that's better informed and less irrational, and they have a certain set of values. It makes total sense to think, yeah, I'd rather have that version of me's values. Just because like that's what you value. You can have a meta preference to have the preferences of a better informed and more rational you. It's all about your own preferences, your own subjective values. In no way does that require realism or a concern about stance independent normative truths. And also, I should say, this is pretty obvious. This is not rocket science. So I don't know why they think that they've got some slam dunk against this view. I don't know what the slam dunk is supposed to be.
Actual me. So
number one, and then number two, like we would only care about that insofar as we're more likely to get things right, but there is no right and wrong according to their metaphysics. So
there would be a. Is he talking about expressivists or subjectivists? If he's talking about expressivists, they would be acting more in line with their preferences. But it's just the expressivist is just saying that normative language isn't propositional. Depending on the view. Hold on, I'm going to need to come back in a second. All right, still recovering from the wildfire stuff and still got a stuffy nose. Sorry about that. It's pretty bad, actually. Well, not as bad as it was.
Yeah.
What's the point?
Yeah.
All right, let's throw out non-cognitivism out of the window, okay? And let's move on to naturalism.
Hold on, I think I missed something there.
Physics. So what's the point?
Yeah. So
that number one, and then number two, like we would only care about that insofar as we're more likely to get things right, but there is no right and wrong according to their metaphysics. So what's the point?
Yeah.
So people can't care about acting more. So like, let's say you're an emotivist. What you take, let's just old school emotivist. You think certain things like boo murder, yay, equal rights or something, right? And so you want to know what a better informed version of you would favor, right? So that you could align your actions accordingly, in line with what you're in favor of and away from what you're not in favor of. Is Christian saying there's no point in doing that? Because what you're in favor of, technically you think that declarative sentences like pizza is good, because those sorts of sentences only express your emotions and they're not true, there's no reason to act in what you favor and against what you disfavor? What? That doesn't make any sense. Of course you would act in accord with what you favor and against what you are opposed to. Why wouldn't you? This is strange. Like, because you don't think it's technically true. Yeah, so what if you don't think that technically those certain sorts of sentences are true? You still have preferences. Why would you not act more in line with your preferences? It's very strange. Bardo says, why do they always act like they own the terms right and wrong? It's a good question. I don't know why I think that it's when you're convinced your position is true and your position includes an account of ordinary language, you take the terms to just mean what you mean by them. And so this is why you'll often see Huemer does this and a lot of other realists do this. They just use normative language in a way that's presumptively realist, even when discussing meta ethics. Like they'll say, well, the anti-realists don't think things are wrong, that kind of thing. Instead of saying anti-realists don't think things are stance independently wrong. They're not careful to make the meta-ethical features of their claims explicit, even in meta-ethical contexts. And I think that's bad. I think it's confusing and unhelpful to do that. But you know, I also just think it's a bad habit. But why do they act that way? I think realists frequently are overconfident about their views and are just not quite as careful as they should be. And part of it might be that anti-realists in the academic discourse have been so concessive that they've largely ceded this language and this ground to realists. And there's very few anti-realists operating within contemporary academic metaethics that are pushing back and are forceful about the realist rhetoric. So realists have been able to seize the rhetorical high ground and run roughshod over anti-realists for the past 30 years or so. And I'm one of the few people that's pushing back in a way that emphasizes the rhetoric and emphasizes the framing and emphasizes the sociological aspects. I'm not saying nobody's ever mentioned it or that anti-realists aren't aware of this or comment on it. I'm not saying that there aren't academic anti-realists that are cognizant of this and have commented on it in various spaces. But typically people publish academic papers and they don't make a point of stressing this sort of thing. And so realists have been able to seize this space. And I'm one of the few people trying to take it back. Now, that might sound like a brag. It's not a brag. I find it frustrating and annoying. I don't want to be a one-man army here. I would like there to be more people on my side. So if you want to get involved in doing these videos or doing TikToks or Substack, you know, get on it, do those things. It'd be great. I don't want to be alone doing this. I don't like it. Andrew Moy says, I think you see some overconfidence in the consciousness discourse. Oh, you absolutely do. Look at the way Strawson talks about illusionists. All right.
Yeah. All right. Let's throw out non-cognitivism out of the window. Okay. And let's move on to naturalism.
Yeah.
So what is naturalism and why is naturalism false?
Yeah. The ethical naturalists think that, well, as we were saying earlier, they think that moral truths can be reduced. Okay. So there's evaluative language that sort of by its meaning entails that something is good or bad, a positive or a negative meaning about something. And then there's non-evaluative language. Okay. Which, whatever, doesn't inherently imply good or bad. Okay, so the naturalists think that you can explain the nature of a moral truth using non-evaluative language. Like you could explain what makes it the case that murder is wrong without using right, wrong, good, bad, or any other evaluative words. Okay, and then typically they also think that you have some kind of empirical knowledge of the evaluative facts, which I think is just a confusion on their part.
Yeah, they'll say something like, we can know that goodness and pleasure are really the same thing, the same way that we eventually found out that water and H2O were the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. But there seems to be an epistemic problem there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, it's not at all the same at all. Right. This is how we know. And by the way, that example that you gave, that is the kind of thing that they would say. They would give these examples of where you found out that something is really something else that's described in terms of a scientific theory. The way that we know that water is H2O is there are two experiments that you can do. One is electrolysis of a sample of water, where you can apply an electric potential and you get bubbles of hydrogen gas forming at one end and bubbles of oxygen gas. Okay. Which, by the way, at the time they did this experiment, hydrogen wasn't called hydrogen. It was called inflammable air or something like that. Anyway, okay. But anyway, you could verify that you're getting these two different gases. The mass of water is decreasing and the mass of the gases is increasing by the same amount. So the water's turning into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay. And then the other thing is you can have hydrogen and oxygen and you can ignite them. And then the amount of gas decreases. And then there's water condensation on the sides of the container. Okay. That's how we know. So those are specific empirical observations that are explained by the hypothesis that water is made of hydrogen and oxygen. There's nothing like that with the naturalist theories of morality. Right? There is not a specific observation that can be explained by thinking that goodness is pleasure. That can't be explained by somebody who has a different view about goodness. Right. And that comparison is particularly important. Like it has to be that this theory explains things that are not explained if you have different views. So if you think that water is made of sodium chloride, you cannot explain those experimental results, right? But if you think that pleasure is bad, there's nothing that you can't explain that could be explained by a person who thinks pleasure is good.
What if we, hypothetically, we do a bunch of philosophy, AI helps us out, and we reach perfect reflective equilibrium, and we have the perfect theory of morality, and we find out, turns out all we actually meant this entire time when we were talking about moral statements is maximizing positive states of consciousness robustly over long time averages.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good question,
something like that.
Here.
At that point, wouldn't we be justified in saying, okay, goodness and pleasure, or goodness and positive valence of consciousness are the same thing?
Well, you're sort of like stipulating that we found that out, but I don't know how we would find that out. It could have been that by good, we just meant causes pleasure. There could be a language in which good means causes pleasure.
Well, the argument against that is what Moore's open question argument.
Right. Yeah.
Run us through that real quick.
Which, by the way, I think it's slightly a misnomer because Moore does not use the phrase open question a lot. But anyway, okay, it's basically you just take some question about pleasure and then substitute good for pleasure, and then you notice that it doesn't mean the same thing. All right. So somebody says, yeah, I think that X is good just means X causes pleasure.
Yeah. The problem with that is that can work in an analytic context where you would say you notice that it doesn't mean that, but that doesn't work in a synthetic context. Like I don't think about water and notice that water is or isn't H2O, or I notice it's not composed of neon. It's the kind of thing that you have to go out in the world and find out. And the same thing with synthetic realist accounts is they wouldn't think that you could just go out and find out from thinking about it. Also, a lot of these views of language might take it to be not so introspective. Like you could adopt a view of language where you don't think that the meaning of the terms is introspectively as accessible as this. And so it wouldn't be the sort of thing you could figure out just by, the armchair. You'd have to go out and do empirical work. Now, if you're a naturalist about the moral facts, you might be especially amenable to taking a view of language where you would approach that empirically as well. If you're going to look at moral truth as being an empirical matter, why not the meaning of language as well? And if that's the case, then this isn't the sort of thing that you could just notice. So you'd have to do empirical research. And suppose you did do empirical research, like Christian proposes, and you found out everybody uses the language a particular way, or just about everybody, in a way where, the best explanation for what people are doing when they engage in moral discourse is describing and referencing a certain set of natural properties. So it sounds like you will have established naturalist realism is true.
Okay, and then I can say something like, but is pleasure really good? And then you're supposed to just notice that does not mean the same as, does pleasure really cause pleasure? Right? Or is goodness really good? It doesn't mean those things.
Well, but that's the key here. And this is where you're showing you are an intuitionist fundamentally. It seems that way.
Yeah.
The common response to the open question argument is to just deny that it feels like an open question. To say that, when you swap out these words, it seems like the meaning has shifted. What if I just go, no, doesn't seem that way to me?
I don't know that is the common response. I haven't heard too many people. It's kind of the response I would give, but I haven't heard too many people say that.
Then you're probably lying.
You're probably lying. And what if you're probably lying? And what if you're not? Now what? People can and often do have intuitions contrary to Huemer's intuitions. I think that's a kind of flippant and glib response from Huemer that's not very helpful. To just say, oh, well, if you have an intuition to the contrary, you're probably lying. That's not a very serious way of engaging with people with contrary intuitions. It's disappointing. I think he might be joking here, but I think that it's how much is joke, how much is serious. It's hard to say. But I find this to be a little bit of a disappointing response.
Well, so just like most people can see that, is pleasure good does not mean the same as does pleasure cause.
Yeah. So notice his phrasing. Most people can see. He's just asserting, like, most people. Everyone in the chat, what am I going to say that is? Most people can see that. Most people can see that it is what exactly the phrasing?
Pleasure. Then you're probably lying. Well, so just like most people can see that, is pleasure good does not mean the same as does pleasure cause pleasure.
Yeah. Can most people see that? That's an empirical question. What most people see or think or what intuitions they have, we don't have research on that. He's not in a position to know that. So what you see here is that philosophers will regularly help themselves to psychological hypotheses, because the claim most people think this way or see things this way or believe this or would respond this way or whatever. Those are psychological hypotheses about the way people outside the context of the discussion he's in, not Christian, not Huemer, not me, how they think, right? Or what kinds of experiences they have. Those are empirical hypotheses about human psychology. They don't do any research to test those claims. It's very strange. And, I repeat this over and over and over. There's a reason why they keep doing it. Let's say that cops just keep arresting people for committing murder. Would you say, why do they keep doing the same thing over and over? Well, because people keep committing the same crime over and over. And Huemer and other analytic philosophers keep committing the crime, the intellectual crime, of making unsubstantiated empirical claims in a philosophical context where they seem to have no interest in or appreciation for the fact that the claims that they're making might not be supported by available empirical evidence, and that they don't have any empirical evidence to support those claims beyond like trivial anecdotal evidence. Really, really frustrating. And, again, you have people mock me for making the same point. Why aren't they mocking? Look, maybe we shouldn't be mocking anybody. There's time and place for mocking, but I'm making a good point. I'm just making it frequently. Why aren't they mocking philosophers for making unsubstantiated empirical claims? Like, who's doing the worst thing here, right? So you have a bunch of really intelligent, well-educated, professional academics operating within an academic space that is highly prestigious. It gets funding. It's in the top institutions. It draws some of the smartest minds in the world. And within that community, they consistently make unsubstantiated empirical claims. Well, imagine if doctors went around making unsubstantiated empirical claims. When there's lives at stake, people go, nah, you're not going to do that. You're not going to go around talking about vaccines that way. You're not going to go around telling people not to wash their hands. That's dangerous. But when philosophers make unsubstantiated empirical claims and the stakes are low, nobody gives a shit. But they're still making claims that are unsubstantiated. On epistemic grounds, it's similarly bad. On practical grounds, it's not as bad because unsubstantiated claims of what most people would think in these cases is not getting people killed, right? At least I hope not. But yeah, this is a sore throat. Now my voice is cracking. Jesus, I'm going back to, yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter. So stupid. So he makes these unsubstantiated claims, and there are people that will mock me for pointing this out, but they won't mock. And again, I'm not saying they should, but they won't criticize them for making those claims in the first place. Which is worse? Which is worse? I feel like the unsubstantiated claims are worse. Yeah, RJB says, to be fair, saying most people is the guilty pleasure of most philosophers. I see what you're doing there with the most philosophers. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what work to be fair is doing there. That doesn't justify it. What's up, Sapir? Welcome. Built to Gil says, watching Lance's critiques has made me realize how many people casually draw broad sociolinguistic conclusions from the way they specifically use language. Absolutely. This is why one of my slogans is that a lot of philosophy is psychology with a sample size of one. And, it's one of these funny things. I'll address this because, some people have said like, oh, Lance, isn't a philosopher. I do have a master's in philosophy. And I will point out, historically speaking, at least some prominent people, I'm not to say that I'm prominent, but people that have gone on or were successful in philosophy did not have a PhD in philosophy. This is a very weird type of, credentialism and inflation of credentials has led many people now to treat you as like you just don't count as a philosopher unless you have a PhD in philosophy. I'll point out, historically speaking, Socrates did not have a PhD in philosophy. So it's clearly like, and if you're saying, are you comparing yourself to Socrates? Look at my article on the over comparison fallacy, because now you're being a shitty philosopher if you think that's what I'm doing. I'm making a point, which is that it's not the case that having a PhD is a requisite precondition for counting as someone doing philosophy or being good at philosophy or being a philosopher, or however you want to define the term. Some people want to treat philosopher as this like special title that you have to really work your way up to get at. But a person that, like, if a person just writes philosophy books, I'm fine with calling them a philosopher. So consider me promiscuous with how I would apply the label, or just not really caring very much. In any case, Derek Parfit had a bachelor's degree. He didn't even have a master's. So fucking what? Who cares, right? Given his work and the amount of effort he put in and how he developed himself, it doesn't matter if he had a degree or not. Friedrich Nietzsche, who someone asked me about at the start of this chat, I think his degree was in philology. I don't think he had a degree in philosophy. Who else? William James, I think, has his work is, what was he, like is in like medicine or something, but he did not, as far as I know, have a psychology degree. And so, historically in the past, there wasn't a presumption that a person has to have a specific PhD in a particular thing to count as a person that does the thing. But in any case, I do have a master's, and I do publish in philosophy journals, and I do present at philosophy conferences, and I've taught philosophy courses. And it's a little weird when some people want to smear me and say, oh, like he's just a psychologist. And by the way, it's not like I have degrees from like no-name universities. Not that I think that matters very much either. But a funny thing is, people will ignore my credentials when it facilitates them mocking me or criticizing me. Or they'll point to those credentials when it facilitates mocking me or criticizing me. People will selectively attend to certain features of people when it helps them to mock and ridicule or criticize. And it's something worth flagging, because people do that, and it just reveals the inconsistency of those critics. I don't know exactly why I brought that up, but it's just one of those things. Somebody recently made a remark about me like that, and it's so stupid. On the one hand, you could think if a person was a total autodidact, you would judge them by their merits and not by their credentials. On the other, if they actually had the credentials, it's kind of weird to ignore them. But in any case, there's something quite strange about people making those kind of remarks. Okay, let's keep going.
I don't think that there's anybody who actually doesn't see that.
Okay, he doesn't think there's anybody that doesn't see that. That's a very bold claim. There probably are at least a few people that disagree with him about that. It's also interesting the way he puts it, see it. So when he says people see this, the framing makes it seem like there's a fact of the matter and one simply sees it or doesn't see it, when what we're really describing are people's psychological states. So, of course, there's that term see. Like if I see a tree, this could be framed in terms of a subjective, like experiential phenomenology, like it appears to me that there's a tree, but you could also treat it in this externalist sense where when I see a tree, there actually is a tree and I'm noticing it, right? So when he uses the see language and he says, there's nobody that doesn't see this, to the extent that what a person's intuitions are on the matter is a psychological question, is he, if he's making the psychological claim that there's literally 0 people that think that it's like analytically the case that goodness is pleasure, all we need is one example of a person that is reporting this to show that he's probably wrong. He would have to then make a convincing case that that person is lying. Now, I don't know if anyone here in the chat knows of anybody. Do you know of anybody that would say, yeah, it's kind of redundant to ask, is pleasure good? Or is like goodness pleasure or something like that? I think maybe the second is a better question. Obviously, people can think pleasure is good, but not think good is reducible to pleasure. Is good reducible to pleasure? Is there anybody that thinks that? And I'll bet you we'll be able to find at least one seemingly sincere person. So this claim Huemer's making, I think, would be pretty easy to refute. It's just going to turn out to be false. There's going to be at least one person that thinks that. At least that's my hypothesis. So if someone wants to find such a person, I'd be happy to post in the posts here on YouTube or in a subsequent video, or if you even find them now, to post an example of such a person to just show categorically Huemer's mistaken about this, unless he wants to maintain those persons lying. But then really it's like, it would be quite strange to antecedently say anybody that makes this claim, I'm not going to evaluate their body language or their enthusiasm or how much work they put into this or anything. Just they're all lying in advance. He could do that. I really hope he wouldn't do that. But if he's not going to do that and he's going to take seriously that he'd actually have to show they're lying, the burden would shift onto him to show that every one of these people is lying. We've got one in the chat. Mike Shavak says, I could maybe reduce good to pleasure. I'm very confident there's at least one person that would say categorically, yeah, we definitely can. I just don't have them on hand. So if you could find such a person, please post that in the chat. I don't have the time to start searching in the middle of this, but Mike is going to be wrong about this one.
And by the way, like, if you think that there would be no way of justifying the naturalist theory if we don't have any access to what we mean. Like, if the person is thinking that good just means causes pleasure or something like that, they must think that we have some access to what we mean by words. Right? And I don't know how we would have any access to it if we can't trust intuitive judgments.
You could take it to be an empirical question. You don't have to rely on intuitive judgments.
Even in seemingly the best circumstances, right?
Now,
in the seemingly best circumstances, what circumstances are those? It's not clear exactly what he means there.
The naturalist wants to reduce all evaluative or normative or moral claims to just descriptive claims or claims about the natural world, things that science can help us investigate. If we want to reject naturalism, how much does this depend on the is-ought gap being a real thing?
Well, I guess it completely depends on that. So yeah, the is-ought gap, the difference between, the gap noticed by sort of like the inferential gap noticed by David Hume, that you can't infer an ought statement from is statements. So you have facts about just the way the world is that doesn't tell you how things ought to be, or maybe more broadly, you just have the non-evaluative facts and that they don't logically entail an evaluation. Well, let's say you could do that. But it's sort of like, I don't see how you could think that. I don't see how you could think that you could deduce evaluative claims from non-evaluative.
So there's one sense in which evaluation and description are actually one and the same. And it seems to be that when you pay close enough attention to consciousness, things don't merely present themselves as facts, and that the evaluation kind of is lopped on top. Things present themselves as truly good or bad intrinsically. So if you put your hand on a stove, you're not like doing an inferential derivation in first order logic about, pain is bad, I'm feeling pain, ow, therefore this is bad. And then no, it presents itself phenomenologically, some would say, as just being bad.
Doesn't present itself that way to me. Am I a liar, Mike? It does not. Okay, so let's do a poll about that. Of course, he didn't say that. Does pain present itself to you phenomenologically as intrinsically, stands independently bad? We're going to do a poll on this here. All right, everybody, there is a poll in the chat. I'm curious how you would all answer the question. So take a look at that question and answer it. The right one says, I've seen some debaters think I'm assuming you mean goodness or badness, moral goodness or badness is identical to flourishing or eudaimonia. Yeah, people do think that. I don't think that's quite as reducible to pleasure. but you could just be an analytic realist about something else. And I'm assuming Huemer is going to reject all of those views as long as they reduce it to something natural. Yeah, he'd be committed to that. So what would be the issue with that? Yeah, and you have stuff like Oliver Scott Curry's account or Fraser and Strelny's, which would take moral facts to be they're going to be synthetic realist accounts that are going to take moral facts to be reducible to facts about that are like conducive to cooperation or something. All right, so we'll see how that develops in the chat, that particular poll.
Are there any legs to an argument like this that would want to attack the Izod kappa, saying no, they're actually one and the same?
So when you feel the pain, you're just immediately aware of the badness of it. But I mean, as you just...
So when I experience pain, I'm aware of having an aversive experience that I don't want to have, at least most of the time. Some kinds of pain, like the muscle burn when exercising, would be good, or enjoyable, or at least not bad. Nothing about it presents itself to me or phenomenologically has any sort of realist vibes. Like when if I do something painful, like I can just tell you right now, because I don't have to do something painful. So, so I have a chronic. I'm always in pain. I mean, at least almost all of the time. So I have chronic pain along with the tinnitus, which I've had the chronic pain my whole life. Where I have pain on the side of my face, so it kind of goes here, here, and here across the side of my head. Now it's usually dull. If I get lack of sleep or I'm very stressed, the pain could be more aggravated, but I'm pretty much always in pain, at least to some extent. Now that pain, I experience it. If you ask me to describe the phenomenology, I would say it's aversive. I don't like it. I don't want it, but nothing about it seems to me or presents itself to me as though it's bad independent of my attitudes or values. And this is something I really wonder about. I'm not even sure that makes any sense. So, Christian, and I've heard other realists say that pain will present itself phenomenologically as stance independently bad. But whether something is bad stance independently is a counterfactual. Like that, when you're talking about your experience, it's the sort of thing that you're saying, this is bad, and it would be bad even if I didn't find it subjectively to be bad. How the fuck could that be part of your experience? A counterfactual consideration. That's not a piece of phenomenology. That's a theoretical consideration. I don't think that can, in principle, be a feature of your phenomenology. Do you see what I'm saying? What I'm saying is, someone could say something like, they take a bite of an apple, and they could think something like this. This apple tastes good. And they could think it would taste good independent of my emotive reaction to it. It would taste good independent of my taste buds, my brain, my prior experiences. Even if I had a totally different nervous system, it would taste good independent of that. How could that belief or that inference or that position be a feature of the experience? That's not phenomenology. That's like a theoretical belief. That doesn't make any sense. It'd be like saying it's part of my experience that if Napoleon had not invaded Russia, he would have eventually conquered all of Western Europe. Like that's a counterfactual that cannot be part of an experience, like in principle. So I do wonder if I'm wrong about that, where am I going wrong with that? Because it does seem to me, and I mean that in the epistemic hedging sense, not in some phenomenological sense. My position is that it's not only the case that my pain does not present itself to me as intrinsically bad or stance independently bad. I think that the idea that something could present itself that way is literally impossible. It does not make sense because the kind of characteristic they're attributing to it isn't a candidate feature of phenomenology in the first place. All right. Let's have a look at chat. Moxie says, I don't know what realists mean by that. I'm certainly averse to pain, but it feels really weird to frame me as being acquainted with some independent property badness. Same here. To me, that sounds totally alien, bizarre, extremely theoretical, and has nothing at all to do with my experience of the world. And so it would be quite something if realists were insistent that, no, this is how people experience things. One, that is an empirical claim. You'd have to do research to find that out. Two, I'm abjectly denying this. So what's their theory about that? That I'm delusional, that I'm lying? Fine. That I'm delusional or lying. Guess what? That's an empirical question, and you need evidence for that. When you start talking about people's experience, there is no fucking way to get around the burden that you are going to have to do some psychology. You're going to have to do some actual empirical research. It's so frustrating that realists and many analytic philosophers generally just don't want to shoulder these burdens. Just, they're so allergic to doing studies. And it's really frustrating. And so, for the ones that mock me about saying things are empirical questions, oh, what the fuck is wrong with you? Am I wrong? Because if you think I'm wrong, show me why I'm wrong. Come on my channel and talk about why I'm wrong. Send me an email, come on my channel and explain to me why I'm wrong. I'll even turn my mic off and give you a timer. You get 15 minutes, 30 minutes. Go ahead. Come on my channel and explain why I'm wrong. Because for the people that just want to mock me, he just says everything's empirical. He reduces everything to psychology. Okay, explain why I'm wrong. Because if all you can do is just mock me, that is telling. It tells me you don't have shit as far as a rebuttal goes. But you do get these people that say that kind of crap. And it's pathetic and tedious. All right. Liberty Prime says Sam Harris thinks something like net utility is identical to or reducible to moral goodness. Yeah, he does think that. Yeah, he might be some kind of weird analytic naturalist. It's hard to tell with his position. Mike Shevek says, yeah, lazy Sunday, I'll bite. If there's no pleasure, it's not good. Generosity, altruism are all done because it feels good to do, or it avoids feeling guilt, and saying pain is not as bad as ignoring implied good, possibly down the line. Now, I don't agree with your normative moral views there, but you are exhibiting like an example of a person that may hold the view that humor is saying like nobody actually has. And it's not, I think humor is just going to turn out to be wrong about that. All right. Mason Ray says, just want to say, absolutely love your contributions. Online philosophy sphere has made me deconstruct a lot of assumptions. I have specifically limitations of weird projections. Yeah, look into that. By the way, speaking of that, and thank you. That's really, really appreciated. Some of the stuff people were saying is weird. Turns out it's not. So some people said like, oh, the Mueller-Liar illusion is not present in all societies. I think subsequent research has shown, yeah, pretty much is. So certain sorts of features of human cognition and that sort of stuff, those are going to be rather culturally transcendent and universal. So some aspects of human psychology are going to be, and others won't be. RGB says, I'm not sure what we mean by stance independently bad, and does pain present itself as bad? Well, it presents itself as bad in such a way that it would be bad even if you didn't subjectively find it to be bad. Something like that, I guess. What is bad here? Some kind of boo, a desire for no. You see, you're trying to reduce. It's just bad simpliciter. Like there's no further, it's just bad, period. You're overthinking it. And if you are wondering what the hell would it mean for something to just be bad and no, there's nothing further to be said, you're conceptually deficient. I'm sorry, there's something wrong with your brain. There's a little piece missing. Whoopsie. So if you don't think the way other people do, there's something wrong with your brain. Apparently that's what at least some realists are appealing to. Now, Huemer and Christian haven't said that here, but you do get people that say that sort of thing. Nowhere makes a good point. Intrinsic equals stance independent. Maybe. It's not always clear, and people are frequently inconsistent with their terminology. So Nowhere Man's goes on. Oh, it's the Beatles reference one. I love that song, by the way. Started playing it in my head. Oh man, what's that other one? I like those really dark, somber Beatles songs. So you have Nowhere Man, and you have the one where she wears a face by the jar or the door. Who's it for? That Lonely People song. What's the name of that one? What is the name of it? Is it All the Lonely People? That's one of my favorite Beatles songs. Yeah. So my mom was a big Beatles fan, and we had the Yellow Submarine, like the video, and we used to watch it once a year. We watched that and Bugsy Malone. Those are our two movies. Bugsy Malone has a lot of actors that went on to be really famous when they were older, but they were kids in the movie. Matthew Broderick, I think, is the main character. And it's a very silly movie about mobsters. And instead of shooting each other, they shoot like pie cannons. It's cute. It's a funny movie. I like it. I don't think it has great reviews or anything, but maybe I like it because it was something to do with my mom, and that has personal value to me. But we also watched the Yellow Submarine, and I just think it's funny. My mom got me as a kid, like watching like weird psychedelic Beatles stuff. But yeah. So whenever you pop up here, it reminds me of my mom, and it feels good. So I appreciate that. Thank you for being here. Anyway, so you go on to say pain might be built in to be bad evolutionary, but that's dependent on my stance. Another agent, different evolutionary background might feel differently. You're right. And Sharon Street has an article about this where she talks about ideally coherent eccentrics, and she gives an evolutionary account of why there might even be a strange being that cares about pain on some days but not on others. And her article is great. So Street, I've thought about it. I'm like, who is my favorite contemporary meta-ethicist? And I do think it's Sharon Street. And it's not even just for her, like her Darwinian dilemma paper is the most famous paper, but I love that paper so much. The ICE paper, ideally coherent eccentrics, not the other ICE you might be thinking of, not that one. This is a philosophical notion. It might be, I think it might be my favorite contemporary meta-ethics paper, but it's a tough call because you have the most influential one on me, which is Michael Gill's Indeterminacy and Variability in Meta-ethics. And then you have a couple papers that had a massive influence on me, which is Don Loeb's papers, one, Moral Incoherentism. And I always forget the order, but it's something like How to Pull a Metaphysical Rabbit Out of a Semantic Hat. Might be the other way around. Semantic Rabbit Out of a Metaphysical Hat. I can't remember. And then he also has that Gastronomic Realism, A Cautionary Tale. Just a hilarious paper. He has a couple other cool papers on meta-ethics too. So those papers all had a big influence on me. The Gill and Loeb papers. Synod Armstrong has a paper called Mixed Up Meta-ethics that I think is really nice too. It's a little more dry, but it's very informationally dense and pretty cool. And he talks about this Pyrrhonian skepticism thing at the end of it, which is kind of neat. So check those papers out sometime. Anyway, yeah, no, I agree with this. It's just not super clear what exactly is meant by intrinsic. Oh, right. Mike Shivak says, is this what T-Jump's entire philosophy is based on? On what exactly? I don't know. I mean, T-Jump has a rather non-standard type of naturalist realism to my knowledge, but I've never spoken to him directly about it. Nitty says, how much pain will Lentz be in by the end? Yeah. I mean, nice, by the way, to figure out what the hell caused the pain issue and get rid of it, but I learned to live with it. And yeah, it's just something you learn to live with. The tinnitus is quite a bit worse because it's so fucking loud. Eleanor Rigby. That's the song. Shit, how did I not? Because the first thing I started thinking about is that Eleanor Rigby. Da, 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 da. And the name was right there. Oh man, I love that song. Oh, lots of people got it. All right. Thank you all. It's just the kind of thing I can't think straight when I'm in a no, imagine not what I'm not even sure I particularly like that song, much less do I consider it a favorite. Also, is that just John Lennon like solo? Is that even a Beatles song? You got me on this. Lennon has Matt Dillahunty. I never messaged him. A bunch of other stuff came up. I don't have a good excuse for not messaging him. I'm just dragging my feet on it, procrastinating. Keytop Podcast says, are realists just confusing phenomenal intensity with objectivity? Maybe. I do think it's possible that they're making certain kinds of phenomenological errors, but that'd be hard to demonstrate. Seeing something feels dense independently bad just sounds like extreme aversion. Maybe. I don't know. No one confirms. Imagine is just John Lennon solo. Yeah, and he has a better, so I think as a solo song, Instant Karma? That song's better than Imagine. I don't know if you know that song, Nora Man. But that was another one of my mom's favorite songs. She liked me to blast that song every once in a while. I think it's called Instant Karma. Shit, I'm having all these brain farts. I gotta go get my head checked. Yeah, no, it is Instant Karma. Mm-hmm. Okay, Sapir. Well, now you're talking a different story. So Sapir says, I don't know, but I like the version of Imagine by A Perfect Circle. I like that one too. I like most of A Perfect Circle's music. So A Perfect Circle, I don't know if they're going to make my top 10 favorite bands of all time, but they might make the top 20. Probably. Because Tool is like top 3 for me. So the holy trifecta of dark music that I used to listen to when I was younger that I still love is Tool, Nine Inch Nails, and Marilyn Manson. And I love all of them. I still go back and listen to that stuff. But Tool really stood out of the 3 and as one that's really been more enduring for me. But if someone said you have to pick your favorite band or favorite artist or whatever, I'd probably pick Tool. But if you have, I'll just say, in terms of some other bands and music I really like, Midlake is one of my favorites. So I really, really like Midlake. What else? And then also there's progressive stuff more generally. King Crimson, I've liked. My dad introduced me to that way back in the day. As far as more contemporary stuff, Porcupine Tree, Opeth. There's a bunch of that I listen to, but I don't know the names and didn't like. I used to buy Opeth CDs, but a lot of stuff I found more recently. I Am Oak is awesome. I really like I Am Oak. Um, who else is there? Let me pop open Spotify and see. The Fragile. Yeah, see, but like Pretty Hate Machine is pretty much perfect. So, but yeah, The Fragile. Is it the greatest album I've listened to? I'd have to look at the track list and really think about it. But like Mechanical Animals, I love that. Uh oh, man. Uh Labs so asks, are you in a power metal? It's hit or miss usually. I'm not really a music buff, so I'm not gonna know genres very well. Like I don't really know the difference between like death metal and black metal and what are some examples of power metal? But probably not though. But what happened to Spotify? I had it open and then it vanished. Give me a second. It doesn't seem to be working. Maybe I need to update it or something. I'll figure it out some other time. Yeah, if you're curious about what music I'm into, just ask me about it some other time. Rhapsody Fire, don't know it. Dragon Force, don't like. Powerwolf, don't know what that is. Stradivarius, don't know what that is. Mike Shavak says T-Jump, I think, proposes something like any imposition on one's will is bad or immoral, including hurricanes. Yeah, no, I know that, but that sounds like a normative view. Like I don't. That doesn't really address his metaethical views. Mason asked, "Did you major or minor in psychology?" I majored in psychology. If you're talking about my undergrad, I also have a PhD in psychology. That focus area is social and personality. But yeah, majored. Didn't do a minor. I didn't do any minors. I ended up with two bachelor's degrees, which is a weird thing to do. I don't recommend it. All right, what are your views on metaphysics? I'm a pragmatist. Is it similar to Wittgenstein? Not exactly. No. So I'm a pragmatist. If you ask me, like, if I had to come down on it, I would say I'm a scientific anti-realist, probably. But a lot of my views are going to be quietistic, but they're quietistic within like the pragmatist framework. So whatever Wittgenstein influences there are in me, they're kind of folded into the pragmatist influences, which are more fundamental, more foundational. So in some respects, yeah, it would be. I'm going to be a quietist about a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of things I think once you dissolve the linguistic confusions, they go away. There's a lot of other things I think once you resolve the practical question, there's no further fact of the matter. I mean, there's something very quietistic about the opening squirrel example James begins with in his lecture, like in pragmatism. So I think that there's certainly overlap between the two, but my general inclinations would kind of fuse the two and probably lean a bit more pragmatist. Qualia quietist. Yeah, I've addressed this. I don't know how long ago, but yeah, I'm a qualia quietist as well. You could see some of my old discussions with Pete Mandic, who's the sort of originator of the idea. Cool. Yeah, I like that we got a lot of traction out of mentioning perfect circle. What's pragmatist? That's too big of a diversion for us to get into. But look up William James, and his views on pragmatism are going to be more or less what I'm aspiring to glom onto. Roughly, it's a view that associates truth with it being the end result of a holistic process of inquiry, in which it's not so much that there's a truth that's fully independent of human perspective or any agent's perspective or interactions with the world, nor is it fully relative and totally dependent on our attitudes or preferences. So you don't have this full-blown relativism, but you also don't have a full-blown realism in the fully sense independent sense. There's a sort of dynamic interplay between our perspectives and the way that the world is, that through the process of acting in the world, truth is something that emerges and earns the status of truth. Truths are provisional. They can change. So what's true to you at one point could stop being true in the future. And it's not that you discover it was false all along. It's that truth can literally change. So truth is a kind of moving target for the pragmatist that is partially subordinate to their preferences, goals, and values, and partially contingent on the way that the world provides feedback to them. So that's very roughly a crude perspective on pragmatism, which largely centers on its perspective on truth, but it's also a method for resolving metaphysical disputes, where one's approach would be roughly to say, okay, well, if you have two competing metaphysical accounts, you could ask, what is the practical difference in terms of what I would expect or experience in the world that would allow me to distinguish between the two? If the answer is none, then it's a trivial dispute, and you could pick one or the other. It doesn't really matter. And if a certain sort of dispute breaks down, you could start to recognize it as being something that's a merely verbal dispute or a practically irrelevant dispute. And you might end up drawing the conclusion either that there's no legitimate problem here to address, or it doesn't matter, or there's no fact in the matter. It's going to depend, be in a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, the idea would be that truth emerges from a process of inquiry rather than it being some target that inquiry aims at. Rachel Majir says, qualia quietus, it's disappointing. Why is it disappointing? What do you find disappointing about that? While you're getting to that, let's keep going.
Suggested it's not that you inferred that it was bad from a descriptive fact about it. You're just immediately aware of the badness. So that sounds to me more like what intuitionists say. The naturalist would be saying, oh no, there's not two different facts there, I guess, right? Although, by the way, I don't think this is a common naturalist view. I don't know.
Yeah, I think Huemer's instinct, I think here is right. He's saying, I don't think it's a common naturalist view, because if you're appealing to something like badness qualia or something like that, there's a good chance you're not going to be a naturalist about the qualia in question. And it wouldn't make a lot of sense to call you a naturalist realist in that respect. So, maybe it's probably a naturalist view like this, but this is also going to fit quite neatly with certain kinds of non-naturalist views. I haven't checked, but Sharon Hewlett-Rollett, I think that's her name. She has a view like this, and my guess is that she'd be a non-naturalist, but I would have to go read her work to find out, and I haven't done so.
But I'm just sort of using this because it's a simple view that, good is whatever causes pleasure. I don't know if that was widely held, but okay. And then, badness would be causing pain, maybe. They'd be saying there's not even a distinct fact. And so, you could imagine somebody who thinks, maybe there would be religious people who think that pleasure is bad, or maybe they think certain kinds of pleasures are bad, and maybe they think they're even intrinsically bad. And then on the naturalist view, then they would just have to be incoherent, right? It would just have to be a view that doesn't make any sense, because these would be people who think that goodness isn't good or something like that, right?
Or they would be mistaken about what they actually
Sorry, that misspelling in the search bar was annoying me.
perceive.
It would just have to be a view that doesn't make any sense, because these would be people who think that goodness isn't good or something like that, right?
Or they would be mistaken about what they actually perceive.
I'm imagining something that's the person's actual accepted view, right? Not a perception. This could just be their philosophical view. Because there are these ascetic monks or something who try to live a life with minimal pleasure or something like that. So maybe they think pleasure is bad, or at least that it isn't good. At least it isn't intrinsically good or something like that. Okay. So are those people just incoherent? Yeah. So like on the naturalist view, there's only one property that they could be talking, and there's only one property. There's the pleasure and the goodness.
Now, this is the final intuition that I think motivates naturalism, which...
Okay, before we get to that, we'll get to more chat. I'm noticing there's just so much sunlight on me. It's weird. I'm not used to sunlight. I'm like a vampire. Julian VL says, under what conditions, if any, should realism be the default position in a philosophical domain? Give me a second to think about that, and I'll come back to it. I'm not sure. It might be the sort of thing where it's under what conditions. So you're not asking what I think, if I think it actually should be realist. I don't know if I could say anything precise about that. When should realism ever be the default about anything? realisms are going to be so different across different domains that it's hard to give a general answer to that. So, I mean, if you're asking me, roughly what I would say is when realism is the more practically efficacious position to adopt within that domain. But that doesn't sound like a very satisfactory answer. But I think it's the right answer. I don't know if I have more to say than that. Mason Ray asks, I've been learning about the Buddhist philosopher. No way I'm going to say that right. Nagarjuna. And I love how early he was on many quietist views. Don't know anything about them. You're welcome to send me something because I don't know anything about them. And if there's quietism coming out of Eastern philosophy, I'd love to know about it. Raisin says, I'll go and watch the discussion you talked about before. So you mean with Pete Mandic? Yeah, you could find this pretty easily. Yeah, I mean, RGB asks a good question. When should anything be the default position of anything? I think whether something is or should be the default position is itself going to be contingent. I don't think there's going to be some universal fact of the matter. So I don't know that I can readily answer that question. Yeah.
Is supervenience, which is to say, if we list all of the descriptive facts of the world, aren't we done? Like, why are we adding these additional alleged facts of normative, evaluative facts? Like, if we describe reality perfectly, descriptively, it seems like our job's finished. We can go home.
Well,
I'm pretty sympathetic to that. Yeah, I think once you describe all the descriptive facts, there's no further facts to describe.
well, it doesn't seem that way.
Well, it does seem that way to me. So now what? Am I lying? No, it really does seem that way to me. But again, I don't think I have the kinds of seemings Mike does. But then again, I don't think Mike has them either. So some of what's going to be an issue here is that when we talk about things seeming a certain way, I don't mean what he does. So he's talking about some special type of phenomenology. I'm not talking about that.
Seems that you haven't said what's good or bad. There's like this whole field of ethics where they talk about, how to evaluate things. So it looks like that wouldn't be foreclosed by just having the descriptive facts, right?
Well, I think it would be. I think it would be foreclosed in terms of conditional relations between our goals, desires, values, preferences, those sorts of things, and the means of acting in accord with them. And I think that does foreclose ethics. So I don't agree with him. And I do think it seems this way. It doesn't just seem this way. I actually think this is the case. So to the extent that I could be said to have intuitions of some innocent kind, that's where mine lie. And this is another thing. I've had people say, I've caught Lance saying he has intuitions. I'll just say this, dumb motherfuckers saying this. You dumbasses. I've written about this like 30 times. I have a whole article where I said, like, if someone says, do you have intuitions? It depends what you mean by an intuition. You have to be clear about it. If by intuition you mean one thing, and it's the sort of thing I think I do have, yes, I have intuitions. Yep. If by intuition you mean another thing, then the answer is no, I don't have them. You have to disambiguate what you mean. You could mean one thing or another thing. I have them under one description. I don't have them under another description. How is this too complicated for these morons to understand who are like, we got him. He said he has intuitions. What the fuck is wrong with you? Put a little effort into trying to understand my position. Jesus Christ. I just don't have the patience for this, for the gleefully stupid misrepresentations from lazy idiots. I'm done with you. For the kind of people that say shit like that, these are the last few times I'm going to say these sorts of things. And from here on out, you're just getting ignored. I'm not going to address you. I'm not going to engage with you. I'm not going to write articles responding to you. Just no. You can have a thing under one description and not under another. It depends how you disambiguate it. That's not that complicated. So, like, these people thinking they caught me. We caught him in real time, admitting it. We got him. We got him, boys. It's just so stupid. And I'm done with it. I've been done with it. But now I'm just making it a public service announcement. Yeah. Anyway.
You could imagine somebody who knows the descriptive facts of a situation, then he's thinking, so what should I do?
Right. This is kind of a Kantian point. Like, we're still almost necessarily forced into a state of consciousness in which we have to decide how to act. Like, at least at the very least, it seems like we can make decisions. And so when you're faced with that situation where you have to make a decision, you're kind of forced to use evaluative language or to
Yeah, of course you are. Well, maybe not. You're not forced to use evaluative language. I think we could probably get rid of evaluative language in principle, but you may have to use evaluative concepts. It's just that though some of us are going to think that those evaluative concepts are reducible to descriptive concepts. Look what Raceland here says. I don't know if there's necessarily a difference between descriptive and normative facts. Normative facts are descriptive. That's my position.
Use concepts such as right or wrong, or good and bad, or better and worse, or you have a reason to do X and not a reason to do Y. So it seems like the argument here is more of you can't eliminate evaluative ways of speaking from our best ways of talking about the world.
So even if that was true, and I don't think that it is, but even if it was true that you can't eliminate evaluative ways of speaking, so like ways of speaking is different from phenomena or properties or concepts. Even if you couldn't get rid of certain ways of talking, like first of all, why couldn't you get rid of them? You just can't do it. There's no way. Like you could, I think, say, I will perform the following action because it is conducive to my goals, instead of saying I should do this. Like I think you just could do that. It may be practically really awkward or difficult or clunky to eliminate evaluative and normative language. I'll grant that. I do think it would be really challenging. It's a useful way of talking. But the fact that it's a useful way of speaking does not entail that it necessarily captures any special type of phenomena. It's also useful to have like definite and indefinite articles. It's also useful to say things like thoroughly or becoming or that. It doesn't mean, so like, okay, we use the word that. Does it mean that there are literally that's out there in the world? Is there a that over here or a that over there? No. Or are there I's or me's? Can you find a me that's not indexed to a particular person? Like I'm me, right? I am me, but can you find a me that's not anybody in particular? No. So lots of the language we use serves various roles, but it doesn't have to pick anything out. And so an anti-realist or someone like me that you could call a normative discourse reductionist or a normative eliminativist or something like that. Yeah, sure. Normative language is useful. That's why I use it, because it's useful. And because other people use it, which is part of what makes it useful. If nobody else used it, then maybe it wouldn't be so useful, but they do. So it is. So it's useful language, but that doesn't require or provide much of a good reason to think that there's any special properties or phenomena out there. And that's entirely consistent with being an anti-realist and having a view like mine. Nothing about denying that there's any special normative properties or phenomena or anything irreducibly normative like entails that you're somehow restricted in using normative language in any way at all. It has no bearing on it.
More like a David Enoch point. So therefore, if we can't get rid of it, we should probably just keep it in our ontology.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
notice how I said keep it in our ontology. So because we can't get rid of certain words, we have to keep them in our ontology. Look at what he says here.
Reason to do X and not a reason to do Y. So it seems like the argument here is more of you can't eliminate evaluative ways of speaking.
Ways of speaking.
From our best ways of talking about the world. This is more like a David Enoch point. So therefore, if we can't get rid of it, we should probably just keep it in our ontology.
Keep it in our ontology. How are you keeping ways of speaking in your ontology? Notice the conflation there between words and the things that the words refer to, the ontology that words could purport to describe. Christian just outright conflates language and metaphysics here. Just plain as day. And I think that Christian is doing this. I think analytic philosophers frequently do this, but I think that they're very subtle about it. They could cover their tracks. And I think because Christian is not quite as like developed or far along, it's more apparent the error that he's committing here. I think it's a very common error. And I think I don't know if Huemer does this, but I think analytic philosophers frequently just mix up language and what the language is describing. And I think we caught him. So I think we caught him doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the anti-realist would say, well, yeah, but it's not pointing to anything that exists independent of us. Like some of them would say, yeah, so there is a question of what to do, even after you have all the descriptive facts, but maybe that question itself is not a factual question. It's just like, well, the descriptive facts don't force you to do one thing or another. You still have to decide what to do, but that fact by itself doesn't mean that there is an objective answer to what you should do.
Yep.
Okay. But the thing is that, but it seems like sometimes there just is an answer to what you should do.
Notice how Huemer's response to that is so tepid. He just says, but it just seems like that there is an answer to what you should do. It does not seem that way to me. To the extent that things seem any way at all, it seems to me that it's not the case that there are facts independent, like about what you should do independent of your preferences or desires. So it doesn't seem this way to me. And, I don't think that philosophical truth should be arrived at on the basis of like Huemer's personal psychology. If Huemer wants to hold the position that we should arrive at it based on our own personal psychology, it's great. I'm going to be an anti-realist. He's welcome to be a realist. And now what? What do we do next? Like what's next? Because we've established how things seem to us, respectively. What's next? I want to know what the next move is.
Which is different from what you will do, right? Because like maybe you'll do the wrong thing, and sometimes it seems like you're trying to figure out what is the right thing to do.
Like we act as if there's a truth of the matter at the very least.
Yeah, you're not trying to figure out. Maybe you'll do the wrong thing. And sometimes it seems like you're trying to figure out what is the right thing to do.
Like we act as if there's a truth of the matter at the very least.
Empirical claims, I don't act that way. I don't think that way. I don't act like there's some truth of the matter. I don't think like there's, or deliberate like there's some truth of the matter. Sorry, I got distracted.
Right, because like maybe you'll do the wrong thing. And sometimes it seems like you're trying to figure out what is the right thing to do.
Like
sometimes it like, is the claim, sometimes it seems like people are trying to arrive at the conclusions about what stands independently true or false, morally speaking, or right or wrong, good or bad. Okay. One, that's an empirical claim. Two, what proportion of people? Who's thinking this way? How often are they thinking this way? How does Huemer know this? And what's the evidence for like whatever? Like the claim isn't even specified in like your typical statistical terms. Like he's not saying more than 80% of the population. He's not specifying any particular population. And so he's making a sort of vague, underspecified empirical claim. And it's not clear how you would operationalize it or test it. So it's just not very good psychology. And it's not substantiated at all. And it's not even clear, like it's too underspecified to even substantiate it. You wouldn't be able to run a study on the basis of what he just said here. You'd have to operationalize things and clarify things and then go conduct the empirical work. He hasn't even done the first step, much less the second.
Act as if there's a truth of the matter at the very least.
And it's not true. What is acting like this as if there's a truth of the matter? So when a person goes to a restaurant trying to figure out what to eat and they decide on one dish over another, are they acting as if there's a truth of the matter about what they should eat? A stands independent truth? I don't think so. I think we could explain that in terms of them trying to figure out what's going to be tasty. And a person could just try to think, could be trying to figure out what's most in line with my moral values. Same thing.
Yeah. You're not trying to figure out what you want to do. Like sometimes maybe you know what you want to do, but you don't know what's the
No, that's exactly what I'm trying to figure out when I morally deliberate.
right thing to do. And then you try to figure that out.
Right. And that's a good point against supervenience, the point against the naturalists, which is to say, I mean, sure, descriptive facts are really important for understanding reality as it is. But nonetheless, we still act as if there are further questions to be asked and answered, as if there was a truth of the matter, namely these evaluative questions. So it's like you take yourself to be the sort of being who can act on reasons, on normative reasons, on that you can consider, weigh up different considerations.
Who is this hypothetical you? You take yourself to be the sort of being. I don't. None of this resonates with me. Speaking of that, let me have a look at our poll and see how it turned out. Close out the poll. If you're here, answer. I'll give you 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Poll over. Oh, right. So does pain present itself to you as phenomenologically as intrinsically or sense independently bad? 60% of people said no. 22% of people said, I don't know. And 18% of people said yes. So 60% of people, that's a few dozen liars in my chat, apparently. They're all liars. All right, let's keep going. It's disappointing to have so many liars in my chat. Oh, well.
And then go, okay, this is more justified. This path is more justified for me to do. So it's almost inescapable. And to deny that would be sort of a performative contradiction.
I don't know if it would be.
What's the performative contradiction? I would love for Christian to point out me acting and me denying in realism what the performative contradiction would be.
Performative contradiction, maybe. Like, we have to think about that. But I know that it would be
I'm glad you
contrary
were
to just
skeptical
sort
of
of
that.
like our common sense way of proceeding, right? Like
Oh,
we
look at
don't,
that.
Contradiction.
I don't know if it would be a performative contradiction, maybe.
I'm glad he's skeptical of that.
Like, we have to think about that. But I know that it would be contrary to just sort of like our common sense way.
It would be contrary to our common sense way. Once again, Huemer is relying on empirical assumptions. Our common sense way. That's an empirical hypothesis. Do you see how there's layers and layers and layers and layers of assumptions that both of the realists talking to one another have, but the way that ordinary people think that are looming in the background? Same thing with Enoch, same thing with so many of these other realists, is they just assume that the default way people think, deliberate, reason, speak, act, all of it involves some implicit commitment to realism. But they're not doing very much to show any good reasons to think that that's the case, because those assumptions that they have are empirical assumptions about human psychology. And you would need data from comparative linguistics and cross-cultural anthropology and social psychology and cognitive psychology and behavioral neuroscience and a variety of disciplines to provide mutually corroborating evidence that converge on the conclusion that, yeah, most people think, act, speak, and so deliberate and so on like realists. And what you would need to do to show that is to show what you would predict under an anti-realist theory, a realist theory, and like an indeterminate theory like my own. And then show that like the overall abductive account, like the best available evidence supports the realist account of all of this data. They don't have any of this data. Like they're not even trying to get it. They think that they could figure out really complex questions about human cognition and language and the relation between them by thinking about their own thoughts on English sentences outside of any context of usage. It's wild. It's like thinking you could figure, like, consider this question. What's the most effective form of martial arts for defeating another combatant in a one-on-one fight in an enclosed space, like an MMA ring? What's the most effective combat style? Maybe it's some combination of Brazilian jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai and boxing. Maybe there's some combination, right? That's the optimal strategy. Could also be that there's a bunch of different strategies in equilibrium with one another, and one strategy depends on others. So maybe if everybody was a great boxer, you'd be amazing if you're the only grappler there. And so that seems very likely to be true to me. But in any case, there's still going to be a cluster of methods and styles that are more effective than others, right? There's all this bullshito out there, like really bad martial arts that's not going to be effective. Now, how would you figure it out? Well, one of the best ways is to get lots of people that train in and become experts in these styles and have them fight each other over decades and decades and decades and decades, right? To actually see what happens when you pit people against one another and slowly gather data. That's how you'd actually figure it out. Now, imagine someone said that they're going to figure out the most effective style of MMA fighting by sitting in a chair and thinking about boxing or thinking about like whatever martial arts they happen to be somewhat familiar with. But worse than that, it's not even like it's Huemer hasn't conducted a bunch of comparative linguistic studies. I have the psychological background where I've run these studies. And so if I made armchair guesses, they would be based off of my knowledge of the studies I've conducted and the empirical data I've gathered. He hasn't done this. So it's actually worse than a person thinking about, like a martial artist thinking about martial arts in their head. This is like a person that is like trying to figure out the best martial arts style from like thinking about like the moves they saw in the Karate Kid movie 20 years ago, right? That is the equivalent, the methodological equivalent of trying to figure out how ordinary people think and what the common sense view is by thinking about like English sentences outside of context, right? It's so far removed from and divorced from the actual practical realities of how people speak and think. It's wild that they think that the methods that they're using are good methods. Also, whether those methods are good is an empirical question. Like, because these are ultimately how people think and speak and reason and deliberate, because those are empirical questions, the only way to figure out and corroborate and confirm that a non-empirical method turns out to be a reliable method is to corroborate that with the empirical data, which we don't have. And if you had that empirical data, what do we need their method for? We just go get the empirical data, right? So imagine there's a group of people that could tell you whether a medication is going to work or not. Like, is this going to cure this person's cancer? I just think about it. My intuitions tell me what's true or not. Because whether it's going to cure their cancer or not is an empirical question. The only way to find out if that group of people, like these like cancer clairvoyants, are accurate judges of whether it will or won't work would be to first test by getting a bunch of people with cancer, giving them a bunch of treatments, taking all their predictions and seeing if that corroborates the actual data on whether the people recover or not, whether the treatments work. So you would need some independent third-party confirmation in the first place to even test whether Huemer's method works. So again, if you're trying to use non-empirical methods to address empirical questions, the only way to confirm the reliability of the non-empirical methods is if you already have corroborating empirical data in the first place. And if we already had empirical data telling us whether people reason or think or whatever like realists, what the fuck do we need the philosophers for? We just go look at the data. So like at best, what Huemer is proposing here is an unverified, speculative, redundant procedure. Just get data. And of course I say just get data. It's really hard to get it. Quite convenient if you have a method you think can bypass the need for it. Yeah, liars, sure, but rich liars. You bribed us before the stream, remember? I wouldn't bribe you, but I wish I had the money to bribe you. That would be nice. Oh, and that reminds me, and Machiavelli, by the way, thank you. I wasn't able, it's the 26th now, so it's kind of late now, but the 23rd was my birthday. So I turned 40 on the 23rd. So I really wanted to do a stream there because I feel like people would have thrown birthday prizes at me, but oh well, too late. Maybe next year. Let's have a look. Julian asks, do moral realists in philosophy tend to be realists in other domains, or are these commitments largely independent? I don't know, but my guess is probably, yeah. There's probably a correlation between whether they're realists in one domain, they're realists in another. Andrew Moy says, it might be circular. People are implicitly realist because their view about morality is correct. And one of the reasons for thinking their view is correct is that people are implicitly realist. Yeah, there might be some circularity going on there. That's funny. I hadn't thought about that before, I don't think.
Proceeding, right? Like we don't act as if anti-realism is true. Like normal.
He just says this. Mike, what would acting like as if anti-realism is true look like? I think it'd look like acting like a realist. It'd be very hard to tell the difference. I don't know why Huemer's agreeing with this. This isn't true.
Normal people care about figuring out what's right and wrong.
Yeah, I care about figuring out what's right and wrong. So do most anti-realists.
And they care if they've accidentally done the wrong thing.
Yeah, I care if I've accidentally done the wrong thing, consistent with anti-realism.
Right. So when you're deliberating about what to do, you're not just deliberating about what fits with your current attitudes.
Yeah, yes, I am. Those are the same thing.
You're not just trying to figure out what fits you with your emotions.
But again, all these empirical claims about what the common sense view is, zero empirical evidence presented to support these claims. You see this? He's saying you're not doing this, you're doing this, you're not doing this. Keep in mind, he's saying this is like the common sense view. This is the ordinary, typical, everyday man's way of thinking about this. He's saying it's A, it's B, it's not C, it's not D. It's A. Just these strong assertive claims, no evidence for this.
Emotions and desires. You could have done something in the past that fit with your emotions and desires. You could conclude that it was not the right thing to do, and then you could be regretful about that, right? Which just wouldn't make sense if there was nothing other than your emotions and desires.
So I do want to take this opportunity. I want to jump into subjectivism now, because.
Okay, so we're at the 2-hour mark. We'll save subjectivism for the next video. So yeah, Huemer makes a bunch of empirical claims. They're all unsubstantiated, speculative, and he doesn't present any empirical evidence for them. So I don't see a strong reason to take them very seriously. We're going to wrap it up there. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and I will see you all again. I will say the move has not happened. There have been some delays, so I'm probably going to be stuck here at least another week. And that sucks because I really want to be in my new house. I'm tired of sitting in a basement. I'm ready to sit in my new basement. Yeah, it turned out we needed to have a basement structurally for how we ended up doing things. So back to a basement for me. I was really hoping to get out of one. All right, everybody. Wow, the stream just kind of went dead. It's weird. But thank you all for being here. And I'll see you all around. And I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you, everybody.